in Yale and the recipient of a number of awards, including the National Security Medal and the Secretary's Distinguished Service Award at the State Department. The ambassador currently is, among other things, the vice chairman of McClarty Associates, an international strategic advisory firm based here in Washington. With that, please join me in welcoming back Ambassador John Negroponte. Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you very much, Clark. Thank you for the invitation. Reverend Fisher, thank you for letting me join you today at St. John's. As Clark mentioned, or alluded to, I've had the opportunity to speak to your Sunday morning group once before, and it's a pleasure to do so again. So I was invited to talk a little bit about foreign policy in the next administration, and I'm happy to try and do that, although I must admit it's somewhat speculative. My comments will be somewhat speculative in nature. Perhaps the best place to start is with what Mr. Biden himself has said are going to be his priorities, and I list four that he's mentioned. Battling the COVID crisis, he lists as number one. Restoring our economy, number two. Number three is strengthening, refreshing our alliances and partnerships around the world. And four is I've sort of extrapolated this from everything else he said. I would add as fourth, tackling the climate change issue. And I guess one of the first things you can say about this list of priorities is while three out of the four, COVID, the economy, and climate, have a strong domestic component, they all lend themselves to the foreign policy rubric as well, and are very much a potential part of our international relationships. I do think the president initially is going to focus on domestic issues, particularly the COVID crisis, because obviously we've got to get that under control. And presumably when he takes office on the 20th of January, I think the main issue is going to be, at least domestically, is how we can ramp up adequate supply of the vaccine to provide coverage to our own population as quickly as possible. But lurking behind that priority, I believe, is the broader question, which is worth at least reflecting upon, which is what is going to be our contribution to vaccinating the other 7.8 billion people on this planet. Obviously, other countries are going to be involved as well, but it would appear to me that this is an issue that lends itself to international cooperation, although I think there's also a lurking fear that perhaps it could be also an element of international competition as well, particularly with respect to the vaccines. On the economy, that obviously will also have an international component to it as we work to restore the economy after the vaccine begins to take hold. And I think there probably the president's policy, to the extent that it has an international component, is going to have to do with trade policy and related matters. On refurbishing the alliances, I think there the administration has pretty much nowhere to go but up in terms of the current state of our alliance relationships there, which are at the very best fraught with ambiguity. There are a number of things that the current administration has done that have actually had the effect of fortifying our alliances, such as sending troops to the Baltic states early in the administration, the reaffirmation, albeit grudging, at various points of our NATO alliance. But I think there's a lot more that can be done to robustly embrace our alliances, and I think that's exactly what the president wants to do, the president-elect. He has in his rhetoric, for example, referred at least once to the NATO alliance as being sacred. And I think he believes that way and will act accordingly. On climate, of course, John Kerry is going to be a strong force in the White House and internationally for getting us back to the climate agreement in Paris, which President-elect Biden has said he's going to restore our relationship with that agreement on day one when he takes office. I think the practicalities of achieving sufficient restrictions on CO2 emissions so that we can actually achieve the goal of a less than 2 degree Celsius increase in temperature by 2050 is going to be another problem. Let me just talk a little bit about President Biden's team. I think the team that you choose to carry out these kinds of policies is very important. I think that the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and others are experienced pragmatists, I think very much in keeping with the president's own philosophy. These are not ideologues of any kind. They're people who have long experience dealing with foreign policy issues. They also have an attribute which I think is particularly important in the arena of foreign and national security policy, which is a close personal relationship with the president himself. There's not going to be any issue of some sort of distance between the president and his closest advisors, and therefore I think you can expect that there'll be less of a revolving door element to the president-elect's team than has been the case in this particular existing administration. Let me mention a couple of what I think are going to be standout issues for the new administrations. The first I would mention is the emphasis on democracy. The president-elect has said that he wants to have a global summit for democracy. I think he believes that this is democracy undergirds not only our own society, but our relationship with other societies. And I think that's going to be a very interesting development. Of course, it's consistent with revitalizing your alliances because our alliance relationships are, for the most part, also with democratic countries. So those will be self-reinforcing elements of that aspect of his policies. I think he's going to alter our migration and refugee policy substantially. He's talked about raising the number of refugee admissions. Of course, you have to do this with the approval of Congress, but to 125,000 per annum, which is a very high number compared to what the current administration has done, which is cut really refugee admissions down to a virtual trickle. I think that clearly they're going to make some changes on our approach to border refugees and border asylum seekers, both with respect to unaccompanied minors and also with respect to whether or not we oblige people seeking asylum from Mexico and Central America to await adjudication of their cases on the Mexican side of the border. So we'll see movement on that front. He's talked about elevating diplomacy and reinvesting in our diplomatic corps and putting diplomacy back in the control of professionals. His personnel announcements so far would appear to be consistent with that approach. There are a lot of ideas circulating, including a couple of major studies, one at Harvard University about what can be done to revitalize and reform the Foreign Service. So I think we can expect some movement on that front. One of the authors of one of these reports is Linda Thomas Greenfield, herself a retired career Foreign Service officer who's now been named to be our ambassador, our permanent representative at the United Nations. Climate, we've already mentioned, getting to net zero emissions by the year 2050, joining Paris on day one. I think that also is going to be rejoining Paris. It's also going to be a standout issue. What are the major challenges? Clark asked that at the beginning. Clearly, I think challenge number one, although it's not listed in his top priorities, but he's going to have to deal with it fairly early on, is the issue of United States-China relations, which have deteriorated in the last 4 years, and in some respects border on open hostility. But certainly the relationship is not only competitive, but I think in many aspects downright antagonistic. So I think there's a sorting out process here that is going to have to take place as to what parts of the relationship can be revived and in such a way as to make a constructive cooperation on at least some areas possible, and what areas are we going to continue to have to act with a fairly firm hand. And I think judging from his own commentary, I think Mr. Biden has a pretty clear-eyed view of both the positive and the negative aspects of United States-China relations. There is the issue of timing and sequencing. With so much to do at the beginning of an administration, how much is he going to be able to do on China early on? I'm not entirely certain. One thing that past administrations have done in that kind of situation when they're first taking office is have an interagency study that takes a month or two to try and outline what maybe some of the major decisions confronting us in our relationship with China might be. Iran and the Middle East, big issue, I think, for the administration. They're very committed to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Agreement with Iran on nuclear matters that the current administration abrogated. The president-elect has said he would go back to that agreement if Iran vowed to scrupulously observe that agreement's provisions. He leaves himself a little bit of wriggle room in his rhetoric of late to talk about some of the other issues that weren't covered by the original JCPOA and which some have advocated be dealt with, such as Iran's antisocial behavior, if you will, in its own neighborhood, supporting rebel groups, the activities of their Revolutionary Guard force, and so forth. So I do think there does arise the question of whether he insists that some of those issues at least be addressed in some fashion as a condition of restoring the Iran agreement. But clearly they're interested in moving back in that direction. And I think we'll see some changes in that area. I consider Mexico to be a problem or an issue that the president-elect is going to have to deal with fairly early on. There's been a real deterioration of law and order in that country. The economy is not in good shape. And after all, Mexico is not only a neighbor with a 2,000-mile common border with us, but they also are one of our largest, and depending usually sort of on the time of the day or the year, sometimes is our largest single trading partner. So I think we're going to have to give that relationship a considerable amount of attention, as do I believe he's going to want to pay quite a bit of attention to the relationship with Russia. But again, back to my original point about the concern with domestic issues, there is the matter of the timing and how soon he's going to get around to those issues in any kind of depth. As recent days have reminded us, cybersecurity issues just keep looming larger and larger as time goes on and capabilities improve and increase around the world to conduct attacks against us and others. And I think he's going to have to give some kind of urgent attention to that matter. As a general proposition, as someone who was a former director of national intelligence, I think I can safely say we've always we've never spent quite enough time on cyber defenses, and our bureaucracy tends to be somewhat more, including our intelligence agencies, more organized around the concept of offensive cyber activities. But I do think that we've got to improve our defenses, as we've been reminded in the last couple of weeks or so. There are a lot of other foreign policy opportunities out there that I'm sure will develop over time, whether it's developing partnerships in Asia, strengthening our relationships with the ASEAN countries, with India, one of the countries which has had quite good relations with the Trump administration, with Japan and South Korea and our ally Australia out in that part of the world. There's the issue of trade. Mr. Trump withdrew from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the minute he took office, leaving us with no multilateral trading arrangements in that part of the world. And that's, I think, going to require some thought. And last, but certainly not least, and related to the point that I made about Mexico, I think there's the question of a North American competitiveness platform with onshoring activities, with countries not outsourcing in as far distant places as they used to. I think there's some real opportunities to develop Canada, Mexico, and ourselves as a kind of a economic powerhouse, a regional powerhouse for the future. Anyway, Clark, those are a few initial thoughts, and be happy to try to answer any questions or comments.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. That's terrific. You've set the table very well, and we have a number of questions, as you would imagine. So let me start with Russia. You referenced in passing the cyber attack, the really massive cyber attack that we've just learned about in the last couple of days. How do you think the incoming Biden administration should respond to it? It seems that in the past, when we've had provocations of one kind or another, including cyber provocations from Russia, our go-to tactic has been sanctions. And it seems to me that we sanctioned, to a fairly well, with little, if any, effect on Russia's behavior. Is it time to use our offensive cyber capabilities with regard to Russia?
Yeah. Well, you didn't mention the third possibility, which is to use our diplomatic capabilities, which maybe the area towards which I would gravitate. Yeah, I mean, sanctions have not worked especially well. I think sanctions tends to, especially if they're unilateral, and I think we've had many examples of this, whether it's Venezuela or Iran or anywhere else. If they're unilateral, they tend to simply aggravate the country that one is trying to affect, and at times can even perhaps worsen the behavior that you're concerned about. I am very cautious when it comes to the issue of using our offensive cyber capabilities. You might, for demonstration effect, might want to consider doing that at some point, but it certainly wouldn't be my first instinct. I know a lot of people say, well, you got to make them pay a price. You got to make. Well, one way to deal with this is to maybe not make it so darned easy, and put a little more brain power into how to avert these things, which I suspect quite a bit more can be done, and including our own domestic legislation and our own approaches to public-private cooperation on these things. It's still been very difficult to get domestic legislation obliging companies to share information about incidents with the government. There isn't the public-private partnership to combat cyber activities, cyber crime, that there ought to be. And frankly, I think that ought to be the focus of our efforts. Secondly, diplomacy has not been tried to the extent that it could be. There have been some discussions, in Europe, there have been some codes of conduct that have been brooded about, and some that exist. But I think more discussion about how to, rules of the road for cyber. I know it's not identical to nuclear weapons, and I don't know whether you can have a non-proliferation treaty for cyber, but you can do more than nothing. And I think that's we made some progress. For example, I think in our talks with China back in 2015, I think it was 2015, between President Obama and President Xi Jinping of China. Well, I think we need more of that. And of course, if you've sanctioned a country and kind of reduced their appetite for any diplomatic contact with them in the first place, it makes it a little bit difficult. But that's the way I would try to go.
Speaking of China, you talked a little bit about the economic relationship. Let's talk just for a minute about the military relationship. How do you think the Biden administration should respond to the South China Sea issue?
That's the hardest question, in my opinion, the hardest question. First of all, maybe some of the easier parts of it. I think we should continue to try to strengthen military to military relationships. 10, 15, 20 years ago, the Chinese military were sort of hid, behind the scenes. They didn't have many international contacts. They felt uncomfortable dealing with us in diplomatic settings. I think that's gotten a little bit better. And I think that should continue. We should have diplomatic dialogue at every opportunity, efforts to avoid incidents at sea, general discussions, periodic meetings. They should be part of any strategic and political dialogue that we have, military on both sides. So that's one thing. The Obama administration supported the Philippines in its arbitral proceedings in The Hague, and actually the Philippines won its case. I don't think it's done anything in terms of altering China's behavior as a practical matter. And I suspect that's going to continue to be the case. So I think we just have to maintain our position of legal support for the winners in that arbitral decision. But if you're asking me, should we use our military to push the Chinese off some of the shoals and reefs that they have improperly claimed, I don't think I would put peace between us and China at risk over an issue like that. So it's going to be, this is a long-term issue. And I think we've got to just patiently, through diplomatic activity in general with China, make sure our position is clear, support our friends, encourage, this may be very difficult, but encourage unity amongst the ASEAN countries, because every time we get close to, let's say, a code of conduct or some kind of positive affirmation by the group of Southeast Asian countries, the Chinese always manage to get Cambodia or Laos or both to disagree with the consensus. So I think we got to work on that as well. But I think patience and, keep reminding China that we are a Pacific nation and we plan to uphold our responsibilities in the Pacific Ocean. What about China and Taiwan? May I just
Please,
see that Jonathan Miller came up on the screen with
please.
that question. And I think what I'd say on that is this existing administration has probably been more out in front and reached farther, pushed the envelope farther than any recent administration in its support for Taiwan. Now, I think, we got to be careful how we do that. And I think it's good, particularly in the context also of the president's elect support for democracy, to try to maintain a good relationship with Taiwan, because it's been such a success on the democratic front. But again, not to the point of abrogating the Shanghai communiques or crossing any Chinese red lines that brings them crashing down on Taiwan itself militarily, which I think if those lines were crossed in some kind of definitive way, there would be a risk that they would do. I would not treat any affirmation by the People's Republic of China that it's going to come to the defense of its interests vis-a-vis Taiwan. I wouldn't treat those lightly.
Turning to the Middle East, of course, the Trump administration was closely allied with Israel, which is an understatement. And we've had very little positive interaction with the Palestinians over the course of the last 4 years. How do you see the Israeli-Palestinian issue being played out over the course of the 4 years of the Biden administration?
Yeah, hard to tell. That's certainly, I don't think that's something that's going to, happen right away. And I think even the Biden team acknowledges that some of the accomplishments of the Trump administration, for example, securing or helping secure Arab country recognition of Israel, like Bahrain and the UAE and Sudan and now Morocco. I mean, these are pretty important accomplishments. Now you've got 6 out of the 22 Arab countries with the political diplomatic relationships with Israel, and I think that's consequential, and it's almost a critical mass. If Saudi Arabia were to come over, then that would really be quite something. I think that's a plus. Some people might argue with the price that was paid for that, like recognizing Morocco's claim over the Western Sahara and so forth. Mr. Biden is committed, I believe, to a 2-state solution, and knows Palestinian leaders quite well. So I doubt he will neglect that issue. I guess my question would have to do with timing. At what point would he want to pursue that issue? At what point and when? And let's just add one other point, which is I'm sure that Mr. Biden values the United States relationship with Israel, as well as Jewish political support here in the United States.
Right. Speaking of Saudi Arabia, how do you foresee the relationship evolving between the United States and Saudi Arabia in a Biden administration?
Well, he has said some pretty tough things about Saudi Arabia in the past.
Right.
So we'll have to see. I can remember right after 9/11, he was not very, he had some pretty stern remarks to make about the fact that those people were of Saudi background, the people involved in the incident. And I think he's concerned about human rights, and he's determined to make democracy a strong part of his platform. So I predict, Clark, that we'll get into the discussion we very often do get into during an administration that is very committed to human rights issues. At what point, in which cases do our human rights concerns prevail, and in which cases do our other interests prevail? And you'll see a tug of war between the various elements of our bureaucracy over precisely those issues as we seek to implement the president's policies. I remember those very well in the Carter administration, for example, and in subsequent administrations as well.
You began your diplomatic career in Vietnam in the early 60s, and so you certainly have lots of experience with long wars and winding down wars. So could you comment on the state of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and how you think the administration, the Biden administration, should manage that?
Well, I think most of the work has been done. I mean, for him, between what Mr. Obama did and Mr. Trump, there's no appetite to go back in there in large numbers. We've got a modest presence in Iraq. We've got a modest presence, even more modest in eastern Syria. I think the question for him is going to be to what extent maintaining some sort of presence like that advances our interests, provides some kind of minimal level of reassurance and security to the affected countries, and yet at virtually no military cost to ourselves. So I would suspect he's not going to withdraw us completely from that part of the world. I think he remains interested. He was certainly interested throughout his career, both as a senator and as the vice president. So I'm not sure we're going to see any dramatic change in our approach to Iraq and Syria in any event, if that was your question.
Yes. Terrorism. Thankfully, we have not had a major terror attack since 9/11. I'm a little surprised there hasn't been a serious attempt during the course of the Trump administration, given the administration's rhetoric about the Muslim world. How do you think the Biden administration should prepare for the prospect of one during the course of its time in office?
Well, I think we should maintain some of the capabilities we have. Our special operation forces are more proficient and more efficient and effective than they were, much more efficient by an order of magnitude, it seems to me, compared to prior to 9/11. Well, let's not allow that capability to significantly deteriorate. Let's keep it up. But other than that, I'm not, and of course, keep up our strong intelligence capabilities. And I don't doubt that we'll do that. But I think we've also moved on in terms of what we think the principal military challenges are at the moment, right? And they tend to be more state actors and the like. And I don't think we're quite in the same position vis-a-vis international terrorism as we were post 9/11. I see here, Clark, a couple of questions, but particularly there was one about Venezuela.
Yes, I was going to ask you that. Please.
Yeah, what about the escalating humanitarian crisis in Venezuela? Well, I heard something yesterday, I'm not sure it's correct, but some reference to someone in the campaign, maybe the president-elect himself, someone's advocating that we have talks with the Maduro regime, which strikes me as a plausible position if that was actually what was said. But I think we'll see the administration moving away a bit from a sanctions-oriented policy, I suspect, and I think focus on the humanitarian crisis that exists both in the country, providing adequate food and comfort for their own people, as well as the several million now, I think, refugees who fled who are outside the Venezuelan border. So that I think will be one element of it, and the other will be probably seeking some kind of contact with the Venezuelan administration, but I think based on the notion that they will conduct free and fair elections at some point in the not too distant future. But I don't think, I think the confrontational elements of the Venezuela policy will likely diminish, if not disappear entirely.
Let's talk a bit about NATO in the remaining minutes we have. Obviously, as you said at the beginning, reviving our relationship with Europe in general and NATO in particular is critically important now that the sanctity of our commitment has been called into question over the course of the last 4 years. What more can we do to reassure our NATO allies of our commitment to the NATO alliance?
Well, I think you're going to see certainly a number of gestures towards NATO. I'm sure there'll be an early meeting, whether it's a NATO meeting itself or the meeting of democracies or probably both. I think you'll see potential travel. You know, people very often, you know, one of the parlor games in this town always is, well, where will the president go first? Where will the secretary travel to when they go abroad? Well, you know, Brussels and Europe is not a bad guess for one of these two leaders to go to France, Germany, Brussels, UK, et cetera. So I think there's that symbolic part. And I think just a generally more positive attitudes towards alliances in general, and the idea that we can't do these things alone. We're at our best when we cooperate with others. We have a multiplier effect through these alliances, and that we plan to take the best and most positive advantage of these kinds of relationships, rather than touting the notion of America first, which I think at times was interpreted as America alone. And I don't think we want to do things as America alone.
You were the first, as I mentioned, Director of National Intelligence. How would you say our reorganization of the intelligence community back in 2004, now 16 years old, how do you think it's turned out? Are we better organized? Are we better focused as an intelligence community? And what in particular do you think of President-elect Biden's choice of Avril Haines to be the new DNI?
Well, I mean, I'm glad he made that choice first, because just the very act, I think I think Mr. Trump may have chosen the CIA director first. I can't recall, but the emphasis was put on who's the head of the CIA.
Right.
And that sort of suggests that nothing's really changed. And so to name Avril Haines, I think, was positive. It signals the importance of the Directorate of National Intelligence and the coordinating and the support role that it can play in the management of our 17 different intelligence agencies. So that I think is a good thing. I think that the ODNI, I wouldn't mess around with a reform. I wouldn't change it. I think that'd probably be opening a sort of a can of worms to try to change that legislation. And now that Susan Collins of Maine has been reelected, she was one of the two sponsors of that legislation, and I doubt she would allow any changes to be made to it. But no, and I think an important point, both with respect to the Foreign Service, the State Department, and the intelligence community, I think Mr. Biden is going to rely more on professional help. He's going to avoid politicization of these institutions. Avril Haines has background, having been the deputy head of the CIA, having worked in the National Security Council. The president-elect has also said he's going to leave our diplomacy more to the professionals, and he's going to support the revitalization of our foreign service. And I think that's the approach. The current president, was not sufficiently respectful of the professionalism of our foreign service and of our intelligence community, or for our military for that matter.
Right. Two last questions, sir. What about the proposed split between the NSA, the National Security Agency, and DoD Cyber Command? Should they be split in your view, as the administration has
I have
talked
no
about?
big opinion on that, other than to say, I think, all the analytic capability is in the NSA, and once you start, it becomes a little bit like separating Siamese twins. It'll be a challenge.
Right. Well, the final question, sir, is to talk about what you began with, and that is the nexus between domestic affairs and foreign affairs. And it's notable in that regard, don't you think, that Jake Sullivan, the incoming National Security Advisor, has talked in recent years about the importance of domestic policy and has tried to convince the average American of why he or she should care about foreign policy. And surprisingly to me, the President-elect's new domestic policy advisor is Susan Rice, formerly the National Security Advisor. So can you have a closing comment about that, tie it all up?
Well, I think, well, first of all, I think she's a very good choice. But secondly, one of the critical components of our diplomacy and of our national security is our economic strength. I mean, without a dynamic economy that represents roughly close to 20% of the world's gross domestic product, our diplomacy and our military prowess become less effective. It doesn't have the same credibility. If our economy were in shambles, I mean, people would pay less attention to us. So I think, and we would have less influence. So I think the economy is important. And of course, the domestic and the international elements of our economy are inextricably linked with each other, as we know from the various complicated trade issues that we've got, be it with China or with the North American Free Trade Agreement countries, or with the European Union, or with the Trans-Pacific Partnership countries. So it is a globalized world. We can't deny that. We're only 5% of the world population.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Ambassador John Negroponte. Ambassador, thank you so much, and happy holidays to you and to your family.
Thank you, Clark, and same to you and all of those of you who are participating in this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much.